All right, well, thank you all so much for joining this session. Thank you for our chair and, of course, to the symposium organizers who have made everything possible today. Here is a short link to my presentation, which you can follow to access a Google Slides version. That'll be the easiest way to get to all the links that I'm going to be sharing. So I'd like to start today with an example of the kind of thing that I inflict upon my students. Now, you manuscript folks out there probably think that this is easy going, but to an undergraduate with no previous exposure to 16th century print culture, this facsimile has a few features that make it a little unfriendly. The fact that it's in black letter, the obvious scanning issues, and even just unfamiliar artifacts of earlier printing processes like those catchwords. It might be asking too much just to ask students to read a text like this. But the teaching practices that I'll be discussing today actually demand even more. They ask students to take ownership of early print text like this one to the degree that they can edit and publish their own digital editions, claiming the authority to bring text like this, and I'm sorry for the phrasing, out of the archive and into the digital public sphere. So in my talk today, I'll be sharing an approach for teaching digital editing and publication that has two distinctive features. First, assignments are designed such that students take on the full process of creating digital editions, selecting their text, transcribing those texts, encoding their text, documenting their editorial decisions, and publishing their texts online. And second, this approach uses a combination of individual and collaborative work such that students both have ownership over their own encoding decisions, and they need to make those decisions in an environment that takes other texts and editorial perspectives into account. So essentially what this does is frames classroom encoding activities through the lens of the Digital Humanities project. Student groups are constructed as encoders and editors of a digital publication. And the aim is to create the maximum possible range for students to make decisions, and then encourage the students, or as needed sometimes, force the students to articulate the critical thinking behind those decisions. So that's like a big picture statement of purpose, but I'm a very strong believer in specifics, so most of this talk will focus around 3 case studies. Before I dive into those, I'm going to provide a little bit of context. So first I want to acknowledge I'm not the first person to talk about this sort of thing, including the talk just before mine. And in fact, there are many excellent resources out there, both for teaching text encoding and for teaching with text encoding, including work by Connell, Connie Crompton, the Women Writers Project's own Julia Flanders, and many others, some of whom are in this room today. The teaching projects that I'll be presenting on have been primarily connected with my work at the Women Writers Project, which is a long-term research and encoding project focused on early women's writing and text encoding. The Women Writers Project has been in the business of teaching text encoding since well before I joined in 2013, through a number of workshop series and online curricula, not to mention our own encoder training. In my time with the project, we've launched a new Teaching Partners program, more on that soon, and we've become more directly involved with classroom teaching. From the really humbling list of biographies that circulated before the symposium, I know that this next piece of context is completely unnecessary for many of you, but text encoding is so central to everything that I'll be discussing that I just want to make sure everybody has like a baseline understanding. So the Text Encoding Initiative, or TEI, is an international standard for modeling text, and it is typically, although as James just said, not always, expressed in XML, or the Extensible Markup Language. And the basic activities of encoding are naming and marking the boundaries of textual features, using what are called elements. So for example, here we have the TEI's SP element, which is used to encode dramatic speeches, and the SP element contains both a speaker label encoded with the speaker element and a paragraph encoded with P. And then we can also use what are called attributes to provide more information about elements. So for example, the SP element has a who attribute, which points to the entry for this character in the play's cast list. And similarly, the quote element has a source attribute that points to the bibliography entry for the text that's being quoted here. One thing you might observe is just how many editorial decisions have been made to produce this encoding. This is a lightly simplified version of actual women writers online encoding. So to inventory just a few of the decisions, there is, in fact, the decision to use the TEI's basic provisions for encoding drama in the first place, It's not an uncommon choice, but it is a choice. And then you can also see a decision to link each dramatic speech to the relevant cast list entry and to provide similar linking and sourcing for the quotation. The former is pretty standard, but the latter was, I can tell you, a substantial effort and not something any project would take on lightly. And then also evident are some of the WP's choices around transcription. So for example, you can see that we are preserving the original text use of the long S character. Not pictured here are the equally large number of decisions that the Women Writers Project makes when we display our encoded text in the Women Writers Online web interface. So the classroom projects that I'll be discussing today start from that same expectation, that encoding and publishing text requires a large number of choices. And then it just narrows the scope down to what's feasible for small groups of students over the course of around a month, rather than, more than 3 decades of work by hundreds of people. The scale is different, but the basic framework is the same, and that's the key insight I want to share today. Students can gain essential understanding of digital editing and publication when you turn them into their own digital publication projects, and then ask them to both make and articulate all of the necessary decisions from beginning to end. Related to the matter of scale, here is one more piece of context that I'll be drawing on. This is a tool that we've set up to make it easier for students to transform their TEI files into HTML. My colleague Ash Clark adapted the Excellent Citation platform, providing a set of additional transformations and support files to make it possible for students to just download a folder, open a TEI file within that folder, then they hit a single button in the Oxygen XML editor, and that enables them to view their TEI file as HTML in a browser. This is not one of the WP's official publications because honestly it still needs some work. But I cannot overstate how impactful it is for students to have such a direct path between the XML and the HTML versions of their files. And this approach also allows students to do some light styling of their text by editing a custom CSS file. So for example, they can display or suppress selected elements, they can do a little thematic color coding, they can change the defaults for how certain elements are styled, and so on. I really love teaching with this platform, and I'd be delighted to share more information about how it works from an instructor's perspective in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to turn to the first of my 3 case studies. So this is a project that I've taught in both digital humanities and Renaissance literature courses at undergraduate and graduate levels at Northeastern. The bottom of the slide links to one version of the class assignment from a course called Literature and Digital Diversity that I co-teach with Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon. In this project, each student selects and encodes a short archival document. Based on shared thematics in the student's text, we place them into groups, and then those groups are responsible for determining the audience and the goals of their collective digital edition. Informed by those goals, they make group decisions about regularization, handling of named entities, annotation and contextualization, representing the physical conditions of their source texts, and so on. We also use the TEI provisions for interpretive annotation to have each group identify a set of thematic tags, such as language related to colonialism or positive representations of femininity. The groups author an editorial declaration that outlines the aims of their digital edition and describes their practices for transcription, encoding, and digital publication. Each student encodes their own text following the group's shared standards. And students also write a reflective introduction in which they explain their processes for transcribing and encoding their texts. This provides a space for them to share insights derived from the process of encoding, and it is essential as a way to negotiate that anxiety that some students feel about being graded on digital work, since we emphasize throughout that we are interested in carefully considered decision-making rather than raw technical competency. We also have them comment extensively in their XML files, which offers another space to show their thinking and to reflect on any interesting or challenging aspects of their texts. And then finally, the groups decide how they want their text to appear when they're published online, which is accomplished by editing the custom CSS file in that DIY citation package. This phase is especially useful in helping students understand that creating a TEI web edition is rarely about showing all of the information that's in the markup. And honestly, this is the place where a lot of the students' investment in the project comes in. They get something that they consider to be real because it's been published online. Most importantly for me as the instructor, publishing their own work online gives students essential insights into other digital and even print editions that they use in their studies, since they come to recognize that these also are the product of editors making a series of choices that condition what is visible and sometimes even what is possible with the final publications. So that's the outline of the assignment. Here's a sample student project to make things a little more concrete. This was created by a recent graduate, Sarah Lamoti, and it is shared with her permission. Sarah was in a group that focused on gender, and she selected this wonderful pamphlet here, Strange News from Scotland, which describes a monster born in Scotland that possessed 2 heads, as well as both male and female secret parts. That language is from the pamphlet, obviously. So here's a selection from Sarah's encoding and her reflective introduction. Her group created an edition for high school students, so their editing overall tends towards regularization, and they offer extensive contextualization and annotation aimed at drawing out insights into early modern concepts of gender. You can see that Sarah's added a couple of comments. Those are the things in green. Even in this very short passage, one is marking a silent correction that she made of some missing punctuation, and another is flagging a usage of they, that's a pronoun for the monster, which led the group to decide that they would tag all singular pronouns in their text. So they got very excited at the idea that this might be a manifestation of like singular they, and they acknowledged that since the monster had 2 heads, it also could have been because of that. And then here's what the text looks like online. I do have to acknowledge, especially since we were just looking at TI Publisher, this is not the most modern looking interface. And if anyone here remembers TI boilerplate, you're going to find this suspiciously familiar. We are hoping to make some major improvements to the default display, but this does at least give students a way to view their texts as they will appear when they're published online. As you can see, the group is using color coding to mark their interpretive annotations, so we're doing like the gentlest possible toe dip into using markup for visualization. It's not terribly sophisticated, but the color coding does make visible just how saturated this pamphlet is with language of physical description, which is everything that's in purple, as well as the little clusters of religious language in green and gendered language in red. And you can also see a couple of Sarah's annotations. This, again, is a place where students truly get to step into an editorial role. And it absolutely changes the way they read the footnotes in their Penguin or their Norton editions after. So having taught this project a few times, it's really clear that the push and pull between group decision-making and individual documents is crucial in enabling students to build their own frameworks for understanding early modern textualities. Phenomena like catchwords and signature marks quickly emerge as part of a shared print culture, rather than being just like a weird thing my text is doing. Students also invest in the negotiation between their specific text and the need for an encoding practice that can be applied consistently across the small corpus. And this was a very deliberate decision on my part. Half the fun of the encoding meetings at the Women Writers Project is that never-ending struggle to balance scale and precision, and I didn't want students to miss out on that experience. As I mentioned, producing their own digital editions end-to-end really opens students' eyes to the constructedness of all of the editions that they encounter in their coursework. It's like pulling back the veil. Once you do that work yourself, you cannot unsee how others have done the very same work in every single edition that you read. And that is really the thing that we're hoping students will take from this project. I love text encoding, and yes, I not so secretly hope that this assignment will put some students at the top of that slippery slope into digital humanities that I went barreling down myself. But the key skill that this project teaches is the ability to critically examine, and sometimes even challenge, the preconditions and perspectives that produce the many editions that students will encounter as students and in their future careers. Okay, so this slide has a few limitations. But really, it's the first bullet point that matters. The main challenge with this approach is that it is an absolute truckload of work. It's a lot of work for the students, and it's a lot of work for the instructors. So this screenshot here is like part of a folder of the stuff that I have to pull together to be able to organize this. The scaffolding, the troubleshooting, the downloading of things, then making sure students know where to look for things that have been downloaded. These cannot be overstated. So with that in mind, I'm going to offer 2 shorter case studies, each of which is designed to accomplish many of the same goals as the full and glorious version, but which have some streamlining to cut down on the bandwidth. So this first one is a project that I've co-taught a couple of times with Professor Jessica Kane in introductory undergraduate literature courses at Albion College, and this is part of the Women Writers Project's Teaching Partners program. So there are some strategic simplifications that we used to make the project more feasible. First, we had each student encode a selection from a single shared larger text. We also streamlined the markup options significantly, and we encouraged the whole class to make editorial decisions about a small but intellectually rich set of decision points, such as how to handle named entities and which thematic annotations they wanted to apply. And then finally, we provided each student with a transcription in a starter TEI file and had them add their more detailed encoding onto that. These choices were aimed at a few key goals. First is that they simply made this project possible for a large and very introductory course. There are some sacrifices in the number of choices that students get to make, but they still are applying encoding to their own text. They're making group editorial and publication choices, and they're coming out of the project with a shared digital edition. And in fact, we were surprised to find that there were some advantages in having them all work on the same larger publication. And the first is that this opened up many more opportunities for peer mentoring. The second is that it meant we could do this. So we modified the students' encoding to apply the Women Writers Project's markup, and then we published that version in Women Writers Online. So now there are two versions of Eliza Haywood's Phantomina in the Women Writers Project's publication Ecologies. There's the student edition in the WWP Lab, and then there's the standard edition in Women Writers Online. And this really helped to add to the reality effect of the project for the students, since it gives them the chance to contribute to a larger publication, which is something that I've always admired in work such as what's being done at the Map of Early Modern London. And then speaking of larger publications, I have one more quick case study to share. So this project is taught in undergraduate and graduate Shakespeare classes at Northeastern by Erica Beckler. I collaborated on the initial design and site development as part of my role as co-director of the Digital Integration Teaching Initiative, which collaborates with social science and humanities faculty to integrate digital and computational projects into their courses. TEI folks in the room, brace yourselves. The main way that this project cuts down on overhead is by doing away with the text encoding altogether. Instead, students edit and publish a single page from a Shakespeare play, working directly in WordPress. The outcome is a generational digital edition where you can read the play in full, or at least as far as the students have gotten so far, but in which each separate page reflects a distinct editorial vision. So for instance, here's one example student page, which reframes a conversation between Portia and Nerissa in The Merchant of Venice as a text thread. Now, obviously, the students who produced this are not the first ones who came up with the idea of Shakespeare but texting. However, as their headnote makes clear, they are adopting a particular editorial stance and expressing that through their published digital text. The student editor's central aim is accessibility, and so they have chosen to frame their page in a format that they expect will be familiar to the high school students who are their primary audience. And my students always pick high school students. I think that they like to be able to explain to people they see as a little less experienced. So to give you a sense of the spectrum of approaches, here's another example which is focused on disrupting sexual difference in the play. The student editor describes this page as split into two frames. In one, Portia and Nerissa are dressed as lawyers, and the editor has used strike-through across Portia's verbal commands, adverbs, and any nouns that attempt to pull her into socialized conditioning. And the other frame, a scene with Jessica and Lorenzo, is situated between colors of romantic desire, for example, the moon and nighttime playing a timeless, intimate landscape, and colors of exciting romantic trepidation, for example, in comparisons to mythological storytelling. I couldn't fit all of her editorial note on there. That's why I'm quoting it so extensively. So in addition to scaling down the technical aspects of this project, this approach also supports more experimental editorial interventions. It is, frankly, easier to use WordPress to do things like adjust the display of the text or to insert images. And this, coupled with a more constrained focus on a single page, frees up a lot of bandwidth for the kinds of deformations and adaptations that we just saw. Obviously, there's a great deal that you miss out on here as well. In general, I found that omitting the TEI strongly curtails the depth of students' engagements with editorial praxis. But for cases where text encoding is fully out of scope, it is still possible to adopt the basic framework that I've been discussing today. The pedagogical work I've been describing is very much evolving and in progress, so I'll close with some brief notes on future directions. First, as I mentioned, the Women Writers Project plans to make some improvements to that DIY citation tool, hopefully getting this into a state where we can share it as a public resource. There are, of course, many excellent tools for publishing small-scale TEI editions, but we're confident that we are not the only ones who can see the value of that push one button and you can see the HTML option, especially for classroom purposes. And certainly the approach that I've been discussing is only possible if you have some kind of adaptable and extremely lightweight publication option. Second, we're hoping to build out our workshops in this space, providing both training and support materials to make it easier for instructors to teach digital publication and editing through TEI. Much of the scholarship on TEI pedagogy emphasizes the non-trivial technical demands of such projects and describes the sometimes insurmountable barriers that these represent, especially for those teaching in under-resourced contexts. So we'd like to do what we can to reduce those barriers. The Digital Integration Teaching Initiative also publishes teaching resources and will be adding tutorials in both text encoding and digital editing as we continue to grow our asynchronous learning materials. And finally, this is an open call to anyone who might be interested in connecting with the Women Writers Project through our Teaching Partners program. We are always hoping to collaborate on new ways to teach and to teach with text encoding. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.